There are few cars in the world that people feel as strongly about as the Austin Allegro. As many people's patient zero in British Leyland's era of malaise, the Allegro is so often derided, both fairly and unfairly, for its design, engineering and construction, with a few little myths sprinkled in for good measure. Beside me, however, is not an Austin Allegro. Instead, this is the Allegro's posh, leather-bound and rather conservative brother. So today on Twin Cam, this is the Vanden Plas 1500. Before we get into it, this car is to be auctioned by Manor Park Classics. So if you see yourself cosplaying as the wife of a landed gentleman in late 70s Britain, then please do follow the link in the description. But while I'm sure we're all quite familiar with Austin, BMC, British Leyland, whatever they wanted to call themselves that week, I'm sure we're all less familiar with the London-based coach builders Vanden Plas. So before going anywhere else, we're going to need a bit of a history lesson. Founded in the 19th century, Vanden Plas were a Belgian coach builder in the days before the advent of the motorcar. As the years progressed, however, their attention naturally turned to building car bodies, producing some of the most luxurious and best finished products in the business. Fast forward a couple of decades and Vanden Plas were by now a rather large concern, and expanded operations by founding Vanden Plas England in 1913. The First World War somewhat upended their pan-European presence, but 10 years later, a new company was founded by Edwin Fox and based itself in Kingsbury, North London. For the following 3 decades, Vanden Plas supplied bodies to a range of British manufacturers, most principally Alvis and Bentley, but also the likes of Daimler, Lagonda and Rolls-Royce. Immediately following the Second World War, however, the luxury car market had shifted, manufacturers like Bentley and Rolls-Royce now opting to build their own mass-manufactured bodies, the Bentley Mark VI making its debut in 1946, followed 3 years later by the Rolls-Royce Silver Dawn. This loss of income mortally wounded Vanden Plas, all while Austin, then one of Britain's largest car makers, were looking to move upmarket. While car building was suspended during the war, Austin's design teams had created the Shearline and Princess, but lacked both the facilities and expertise required to build the latter. Offering £90,000 to buy the company, Vanden Plas became a subsidiary of Austin in 1946. The following year, Kingsbury began producing the Princess, becoming, over the decades, producers of an array of genuinely luxurious and unique Austin saloons. Before leaving this sphere, however, we're going to have to address the name, because I'm sure some seemingly pedantic viewer will have already rushed down into the comments, assured in their knowledge that it's actually pronounced Vanden Plas. Us Brits have a tendency to corrupt names and to make them sound posher, therefore more French, than they actually are. Indeed, throughout the 60s, 70s and beyond, whoever was responsible for Kingsbury did pronounce it as Vanden Plas. But if we refer back to the history, we learn that it's a Flemish name, so Vanden Plas is at least more authentic. Regardless, this is essentially the same Vanden Plas that built the Allegro here. Indeed, these cars were not produced at Longbridge beside the more normal Austin badged Allegros, and built at Kingsbury too were its predecessors, the 1100 and 1300. The ADO 16, as the 1100 was codenamed, has to be one of the most rebadged cars ever built. Between 1962 and 1974, it was available just in Britain as an Austin, a Morris, an MG, a Wolseley, a Riley and a Vanden Plas. They were all ostensibly the same car, and recognisably so as well, each of the 6 marks acting more as trim levels than individual cars. Such an arrangement came about at the end of the 1950s, following Austin's merger with their arch-rivals Morris to form BMC, or the British Motor Corporation. BMC was by far and away Britain's largest car maker, yet their plethora of underlying marks led them to these distinctions. The base of the range were your everyday Austins and Morrises, followed by the luxury Wolseley and sporting MG. Riley combined sporting character with luxury features, while a Vanden Plas soared far above the rest as the luxury flagship of the range. For much of the 60s, the Vanden Plas Princess 1100 was Kingsbury's baby. There was no Vanden Plas Mini, for example. Sitting above, however, was the Austin Westminster-based Vanden Plas Princess 4-litre R, whose engine was supplied by Rolls-Royce, hence the R, while the descendant of the original Princess was now known as the Vanden Plas Princess 4-litre Limousine. Rather than being watered down, however, Kingsbury continued to produce genuinely unique and hand-built luxury cars. This was not the kind of arrangement that Ford later had with Ghia and Vignale. Instead, the folks at Vanden Plas, experienced in producing cars with the finest of materials to the highest of standards, were allowed to continue doing so. In the meantime, however, BMC was undergoing a change. In 1966, they bought Jaguar, and 2 years later, they merged with the Leyland Motor Company to form the infamous British Leyland. The new firm brought even more overlapping marks and models into the fold, but for all intents and purposes, what used to be BMC had now been reorganised into the Austin Morris division, of which Vanden Plas was, of course, a member. Regardless, it was understood by all that at least some rationalisation was necessary, and so the old Austin-based 4-litre limousine was replaced at Kingsbury by the new Daimler limousine. Such was the history surrounding Vanden Plas that the new top-of-the-line Jaguar XJs both received interiors from Kingsbury and were named the Daimler Vanden Plas. The smaller 4-litre R, however, is the only one of the three 1960s Kingsbury-built cars that was not properly replaced. There were prototypes produced of an Austin 3-litre based car, as well as a Vanden Plas 1800 and later a version of the Princess that would have sat beside our Allegro-based Vanden Plas. None of these came to fruition, however, leaving our friend here as, curiously, the only Austin-based Vanden Plas to emerge from British Leyland. You're going to have to hold that thought though, because we will be back to it later. For now, the rationalisation spread all the way across the division, because everybody realised that the badge engineering was getting a little bit silly. Ford had made everybody realise that brand identity was a powerful thing, and by marketing the Cortina as an L, an XL or a GXL, they'd been able to streamline their marketing and go in on the image of Ford and of the Cortina much more than the deeply fragmented Austin Morris. All of a sudden, Riley was out, and MG was now reserved for sports cars. Wolseley and Vanden Plas were to remain for now, but even Austin and Morris were split down the middle. A couple of years before the Allegro, we met the similarly infamous Morris Marina. Unusually for a firm so invested in fluid suspension and front-wheel drive, however, the Marina was deeply traditional. Cobbled together from the Morris and Triumph parts bins, the rear-drive Marina was developed to prioritise simplicity and profitability. Essentially, it existed to go Cortina chasing. Austin, on the other hand, would continue down its previous path, the Allegro directly replacing the old 1100. To cut a long story short, at its launch in 1973, the Austin Allegro was only available as an Austin Allegro. If you were looking for a decently spec'd but still affordable car, you'd have plumped for something like an Allegro 1300 Super Deluxe. But if you had a bit of something about you, then maybe you'd have moved to the top of the ladder, opting for an Allegro 1750 SS. The following year, however, BL would wheel out the coach-built Vanden Plas 1500. We'll deal with the headline act very shortly, but I first want to discuss exactly what this means. After all, I've made it very clear that, in this era at least, Vanden Plas cars were genuinely special. And so, this car is not badged anywhere as either an Austin or an Allegro. It is a Vanden Plas 1500, no more, no less. To those ends, it received its own brochures, its own marketing, all disconnected from the standard Allegro, presumably in order to build its own specialist image. I've mentioned already how these cars were built at Kingsbury, but the basic body shell and mechanical components all had to make their way over from Longbridge, and the way they achieved that was unorthodox. Like any other Allegro, these cars were assembled into a running state, but then left completely untrimmed. They were fitted with a single dummy driver's seat, then driven from Longbridge to Kingsbury, apparently so the owner wouldn't have to run the car in. Sounds like a laborious, unnecessary and even potentially damaging activity, but the same thing was done with the Daimler Vanden Plas, which were each driven from Browns Lane to Kingsbury to receive their specialist treatment. Once accepted into Vanden Plas, however, they weren't only fitted out, but also rectified to a far higher standard than the Allegros at Longbridge. The doors, for example, were regularly rehung in order to get them fitted just right, while paint runs hidden in door jambs were sanded out. To give you an idea of the attention paid, each Vanden Plas 1500 took 2 days to trim and rectify. The result, however, is little short of spectacular. This particular car maybe doesn't do it justice thanks to the dark colour, but the quality of this interior isn't just leaps and bounds ahead of any other small family saloon, it's in a different league. The smell as you step aboard is intoxicating, and it's littered with features as well. There are reading lights in the back and even armrests front and rear. Then it's all trimmed in the same grade of Connolly leather as both the Daimler Vanden Plas and the Daimler Limousine. There are some surfaces in here that are, I'm afraid, vinyl, but that's a given. For all the wearing surfaces, however, this is proper leather. Naturally, there are burr walnut door cappings and a walnut dashboard, which you'll notice is completely unique to the Vanden Plas. Standard Austin Allegros had a totally different plastic dashboard, but we couldn't sink to such inadequacies in here. Naturally, the Evian carpets are complemented by a brushed headlining, but here's what you've all been waiting for: the walnut picnic tables. Having just this morning jumped out of a silver shadow and into this, I think it's very fair to describe it as a mini Rolls-Royce. What doesn't carry quite the panache, however, is the exterior styling. Reportedly, the conversion was penned by Kingsbury's then managing director, Roland Fox, son of Edwin Fox. And while there was clearly little that could be modified, the sheerness of the grille was questioned even from within. When quizzed on the subject, Fox said that Vanden Plas customers demanded a proper view, therefore necessitating the height. While I'm the kind of chap who would somewhat defend an Allegro SS, its black detailing, vinyl roof, interesting grille and cool wheel trims acting as a tribute to the era from which it was born, the VP just cannot be. The Allegro is an objectively ugly car, and while anyone nerdy enough to get this far into this video will surely know that it wasn't supposed to be this way, it emerged this way nonetheless. When the car is tarted up with all the sport special features, it draws your attention away from just how shockingly poor the proportions are. Yet when returned to a more simple, refined specification, it really jumps out at you. The scalloping down the doors, the narrow track and the bulbous wheel trims are all just a mess. But there's only one part of the Allegro's detail that I think they got wrong: the square headlamps and disjointed indicator units that curve into the front wing. Sure, you could mark out a standard Allegro as looking distinctly old-fashioned, but it's only the car's proportions that I believe actually make it ugly. That was, until they grafted the Brandenburg Gate onto the front. It doesn't just look out of place, clearly hailing from a different era, but it takes the Allegro's sad face and makes it look really sorry for itself. This car appears almost as if it's suffering from a condition. Mercifully, however, this point returns us to the thought we held earlier. Compared to the frumpy and bubbly Allegro, the old 1100 was a very pretty little car. Not only was it incredibly popular, but the era from which it hailed and its sharp Pininfarina lines suited the upright grille, the elegant paint colours and the wood and leather ambience of its interior. Its successor, however, clearly did not. But if the larger Austins were no longer receiving the Vanden Plas treatment, then why did this, the ugliest and most vilified of all British Leyland's products? Well, if we rewind to 1974, we see that BL was scrambling to find even the smallest of profits. They'd go bankrupt at the end of the year, the government effectively nationalising them to avoid an economic and industrial calamity, considering BL's then size. This explains why the Allegro body was carried over virtually unchanged, just that big grille being grafted onto the front. But in terms of production, the old 1100 and 1300 were responsible for an entire third of Kingsbury's turnover. So a Vanden Plas version of the Allegro was critical to their future profits. Of course, it placed the car in esteemed company, being produced beside the Daimler limousine, but I'm afraid it didn't fool anyone. I've seen various commentators from both period and today who describe the 1500 as a pound shop Rolls-Royce, or as a knockoff Rolls-Royce. And while I feel that is a very fair conclusion when you just observe this car, I don't think it's so fair when you take it in context. We've already been through not only the lengths to which they went in making the Allegro feel like a proper luxury car, with the beautiful leather, the thick carpets and deep wood, but also the history of Vanden Plas and of the Kingsbury works. It's clear that this was a very professional job, orchestrated by talented and experienced craftspeople, but that means that it's an incredible shame. They were lumped with the Austin Allegro and forced to build it, meaning that a previously proud name was being dragged through the mud by having to build this car. The Austin Allegro is a car that should never have existed in the form it did. But in the event, the basic car missed all its sales expectations. It built a terrible reputation with many of its owners, becoming a symptom of British Leyland's failure and gaining a level of infamy that transcends not only the automotive world, but also generations. While many of its ills are overstated, poorly understood, or exist purely due to myth, it remains a tremendously difficult car to defend. After all, you had to reject the likes of the Citroën GS, Alfa Sud, and indeed the Volkswagen Golf in order to drive around in a bit of a pudding. Having said all this, however, we return to BL's new strategy that I mentioned earlier on. The idea that Morris's would be simple and old-fashioned, while Austin's, including the Allegro, would be novel, interestingly engineered and forward-looking. Indeed, 1973 was the year in which Britain joined the European community, and the standard Allegro was marked as being British Leyland's driving force for Europe. As Austin Morris pioneered, the Allegro has a transverse engine and front-wheel drive, powered in lesser models by the same overhead valve A-series engine as both the Mini and 1100. It has independent suspension all round, by double wishbones front and trailing arms rear, all while it floats on fluid. This is the Allegro's big boast, because unlike its forebears, the Mini and 1100 for example, the Allegro used hydrogas suspension, an upgrade on the previous hydrolastic, which means that it was improving on its predecessors. And indeed, hydrogas would be used on a number of very successful cars in the future, some of which drove, rode and handled, if rode is the right word even, really very, very nicely indeed. The K-Series Rover Metro, for example, and even the MGF, living through to 2002. The Allegro, however, is another symptom of British Leyland's downfall. Because like the Austin Maxi that was launched a few years before, the Allegro wasn't really finished in 1973. And they continuously tackled its issues, and they consistently revised bits of it here and there for the next 2 years or so. Finally, by maybe 1976, bringing us a car that was finished-ish. The Austin Maxi is probably a little bit more famous for having that problem, because the Maxi received a facelift, it received a new engine choice and all new trim levels, even a new dashboard, within 12 months of its launch. You can really see why British Leyland were heading down the pan. But with this car we have, of course, hydrogas suspension. Back to the point. And hydrogas, it does what it says on the tin really, it is Hydra gas. And so the Hydra bit does your damping and the gas bit does your springing. So we'll start with the gas. And by having high pressure nitrogen gas in a sphere, one at each corner of the car, you have your suspension. Gas, of course, can compress and therefore you get springing. Fluid, however, cannot, and that brings us to the Hydra section, the damping section of the system, which is actually interlinked front to rear on each side, but remains independent side to side. The actual damping is achieved through a set of valves in each displacer on each corner of the car, and then as the car encounters a bump or whatever, it's displaced through the valve and then down the pipes to the rear of the car or the front of the car. In a sense then, hydrogas kind of anticipates the road ahead of it. It's a very, very clever system that can perform fantastically well, but full disclaimer, this car is not performing perfectly. Not because there is anything wrong with it, just because it's old. So over time, these hydrogas cars, they need to have the gas half of the system replenished, because naturally the gas escapes. And this one hasn't had that done, so it is original, untouched. And you can't do that at home with a pump, you need to get a specialist company to do it. Fortunately, there are a few out there, so there are no issues. It would just be a good idea for whoever buys this car to do that to it. For us, that means that this car rides a little bit more stiffly than it would have done back in the late 1970s, early 1980s. So it's not absolutely representative. That's what I'm trying to say. In order to maintain the ride height of the car, you need to put more of the damping fluid in it. And so the car ends up riding stiffer, it has stiffer damping, and as a result, this car is quite firm. That's not necessarily such a bad thing. It doesn't make it uncomfortable, but it is nonetheless firm. But what I know hydrogas can deliver is this brilliant magic carpet, floaty ride quality that is, it's absolutely tremendous. And then when you get it into a corner, and because it can anticipate the road beneath it, it stiffens up. The progressive nature of it means that then it performs really well in the corners. So it's a great compromise for a small car. But for a luxury car as well, it makes perfect sense. Of course, this particular one is quite firm, as I said, but hydrogas does give that quality when it's performing perfectly. What maybe isn't befitting a luxury car is the fact that this car doesn't have power steering. And so, it's not heavy by any stretch of the imagination, but you'd maybe expect it to be a bit lighter than it is. Certainly, however, this car feels very secure on the road. It seems to handle perfectly well. It has quite a nice turning to it, and while there is a bit of body roll, it does respond very nicely. At the end of the day, we have double wishbones up front and trailing arms at the back, which are a great suspension system. And for many, many years, a lot of British Leyland cars, which have, many of which have much greater reputations than the Allegro, the Mini I'm thinking about primarily, handled fantastically. And this car does not disgrace itself at all in the way it drives. What I will say, however, is that it's a little bit fidgety. In the Allegro, it's quite well known that they didn't quite get the damping rates right. And while this is a late Vanden Plas 1500, in which they had messed with the damping rates, etc., to make it drive, a lot better than the early ones did, it still doesn't feel quite as composed as the likes of a Metro did many, many years later. Neither does it feel quite as composed as a Maxi does. But I don't see much wrong with this car at all in the way it actually performs in terms of suspension out on the road. It is quite an enjoyable little thing. Unlike its predecessor, however, the Allegro had quite a range of engine choices. So I've already mentioned the smaller A-Series engine cars, but the Allegro 1500 and 1750 all used BL's E-Series engine, which was developed only a few years before, again for the Austin Maxi. And it's an overhead cam engine, which was very modern for the era, but what isn't quite so modern is the fact that it is enormously undersquare. What that means is that the bore is very, very narrow and the stroke is very long, so the valves can only be quite small. It also means that the engine produces great torque, but it doesn't really want to rev. This car very much runs out of puff at higher revs. It's not designed to be enjoyable in a way, this engine. It's more designed to just perform and be very tractable when you need it. Unfortunately as well, the vast majority of Vanden Plas Allegros were 1500s. Only late automatics were available with the 1750. This, of course, is a 1500 with this automatic gearbox. And with a single carburettor, that means it produces about 70 brake horsepower, which is very adequate for its time, but it's absolutely no more. In fact, a lot of people say that the Allegro's power units were beginning to look outdated, especially by the mid-1970s in terms of their power output. They were not as powerful as maybe they should have been. And while driving this car, which of course is stunted a little bit by its 4-speed automatic, very suitable though it is for the Vanden Plas, it is a car that needs its kick down on the gearbox. Even when we're just pootling about here at quite normal speeds, this car does feel like it needs some extra gears. And you can feel it changing down as well. It's not absolutely the smoothest of gearboxes. I've just done the obvious thing and I put the wipers on rather than change the indicators. I promise you, that's the first time I've done this. Now this 4-speed automatic is very, very smooth when it's going up the box. When it's going down, you can have a little bit of a thud from it every now and then. But regardless, considering what it is, the kind of era it's from, it is perfectly adequate. Again, that's a word that's starting to come up quite a bit today, but nonetheless, it is. I would even wager that it's better than the manual. Nothing to do with the vibe of this car and how it kind of suits the automatic changing. Instead, due to the fact that the E-Series manual, which was a 5-speed gearbox as standard, don't forget, something very novel for the early 70s, is well known for having quite a rubbish gear change. And I've driven Austin Maxis with the E-Series engine with a manual gearbox, and the gear change it's quite hopeless, let's be honest. So the fact that this is an automatic, although it is only 4 speeds, and it dulls a little bit of the acceleration, I think again, it is the correct choice for this car. I do wish it were the 1750 because it does need that bit more power. And because it needs that bit more power, you're having to work the engine quite a bit. And the E-Series is not a noisy engine by any stretch of the imagination. But in a relatively small car, even with all the extra sound deadening, you can still hear it come to life. And the E-Series is not an enormously smooth engine or an enormously sonorous engine either. When BL were designing it in the late 60s, it looked as though it would be an ultra-modern, it was going to be a modular engine as well. In fact, it was a modular engine. But when they were designing it, they wanted that overhead camshaft because they wanted to look very modern. In this era, I think the best little 4-cylinder engine was the Lampredi engine that was fitted to, Fiat 127, 128, etc. But the E-Series isn't like that. The E-Series feels quite old-fashioned in a way. And while it gives you that very tractable, torquey nature that I mentioned a moment ago, it also feels as though it doesn't enjoy being worked. And as this is the 1500, it needs to be worked in order to really go anywhere. And so you can hear as we're accelerating, and we're barely gaining any kind of speed, but you can hear the revs of the engine come to life when it's sat on the torque converter. So from driving this car, I'm not met by anything horrible. It is perfectly fine. It is very, very usable as a compact family car from the late 1970s. Sure, I think the steering could do with being a little bit lighter, but in terms of the sound levels in here, there's very little road noise. It's very refined with all the Vanden Plas treatment. Sure, we have to get that engine working, and yeah, there's the kickdown going, and we're struggling to get up to 35 miles per hour. It's just not fast. We are going up a hill, I should add. But it's not a performance car by any stretch of the imagination. But for a Vanden Plas, for something that you don't really see as having any get up and go anyway, it's the kind of car that isn't engineered for that. I feel it makes an awful lot of sense. Certainly the Allegro is not a bad car to drive. It's imperfect, sure, and there are better British Leyland cars, BMC, British Leyland, Austin Rover later on, of course. But it doesn't disgrace itself when you actually take it out on the road. I'd be really intrigued to drive a twin carburettor 1750 Allegro, first of all to see how much get up and go it's got with a manual gearbox, but also to feel, to experience, to hear what this car feels like without the Vanden Plas interior, without all the extra sound deadening, the thick carpets, etc., and see how much louder it is. Because as refinement goes, and I've got the rear window open, by the way, I'm very, very pleased. There is nothing in terms of its Vanden Plasness that I would ever complain about here. The Vanden Plas 1500 is a suitably luxurious version of what would have usually been a very normal small family saloon, or at least it would have been if this was still the 1950s. BMC got away with the Vanden Plas 1100 and even Wolseley and Riley versions of the Mini, but the latter were suitably replaced by the Mini Clubman in 1969. Only that small, loyal but diminishing customer base forcing the production of the Allegro Vanden Plas. In producing this car, British Leyland had taken an already poorly received car and made it downright embarrassing. Kingsbury may have been a generally peaceful place to work, producing genuinely high-end luxury cars, but it was not long for this world. With Jaguar more than able to build its own cars, and the now state-owned British Leyland striving for savings, Vanden Plas was closed in 1979. Daimler limousines were now produced at Browns Lane, while the ill-fated Allegro would move to the MG plant at Abingdon, where it too would be canned only the following year. From that point on, the name would be carried over to the top-spec versions of many Austin Rover and Jaguar cars, but it would only be a name, used for the final time in 2009 on the X350 Jaguar XJ. The Allegro, therefore, was the last true Vanden Plas product, marked out considerably when parked beside an Austin. But this is not a step up in the way an Audi A3 is from a Volkswagen Golf. Instead, this is your full Aston Martin Signet. But that doesn't mean that it's any less cynical, perceived as little other than a symptom of British Leyland's failure. Even in this era, BL were building some very popular cars. The Allegro certainly didn't disgrace itself in the market, while the Marina had a solid place in Britain's top 5 sellers. Naturally, the Mini was doing its thing, the evergreen sweetheart it was, but comparing these results to the sheer size of the firm, and it was a step down from the 1960s. In that decade, the old 1100 and 1300 only failed to be the best-selling car in the country in 1 year, 1967. Whatever their faults, and numerous they were, the 1100's style and dynamics made it incredibly popular. Whatever BL replaced it with, therefore, would naturally remain at least somewhat successful. But it's telling of the Allegro's style and dynamics that its relative sales fell off a cliff. This is something the car's defenders curiously ignore, the fact that its sales were assured thanks only to the car it succeeded. In reality, the Allegro's total lack of style, as well as its average dynamics, uninspiring drivetrain, and of course BL's growing abysmal image, forced it gradually down and down the sales charts. That's without mentioning the Volkswagen Golf. But with the Vanden Plas, an already ugly and uninspiring car had grown even uglier. And as the rest of the world was rapidly moving on, luxury becoming more restrained and more elegant, these cars only stuck out like a sore thumb. Ignored for their virtues, instead vilified as a fuddy-duddy throwback. The point this brings us to, therefore, is one I've grown steadily accustomed to over the years of doing twin cam, and that's nuance. The Vanden Plas 1500 was undoubtedly a cynical and dreadfully judged luxury version of the Allegro. Indeed, I would say that this car deserved to fail more than it actually did. But that doesn't mean that I can't also appreciate what it did right. By sending the Allegro shell away to Kingsbury, Vanden Plas had created something that felt genuinely upmarket. The interior of this car looks right, it smells right, and thanks to all the extra sound deadening, it's a very refined small family saloon that retains all the virtues of the original Allegro, producing efficiency in quite compact dimensions. So the Vanden Plas 1500 is a convincing entry-level luxury saloon car, just as long as you totally ignore reputations and lose all sense of style. And with that, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to Twin Cam as well. I'm forever indebted to my wonderful Patreon supporters, so if you'd like to support me that way, then please do follow the link in the description. And I'll have more videos coming along soon.